President Trump moves to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook for cause, citing allegations that she made false statements on mortgage documents. But Cook says she'll refuse to go, setting up a legal and maybe a constitutional battle over the Fed and its independence on monetary policy.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, columnists Alicia Finley and Joe Sternberg. Add one more name to the list of public officials fired by a Trump tweet, or I guess now it's a Truth Social post. That's Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. Last week, the president's housing regulator, Bill Pulte, posted to social media a criminal referral he had made for Cook, accusing her of filing for two mortgages at around the same time, with both homes claimed as her primary residence. The Justice Department is reportedly looking into this, but President Trump isn't waiting. Here's part of the letter that he posted on Monday night to Truth Social. The Federal Reserve has tremendous responsibility for setting interest rates and regulating reserve and member banks. The American people must be able to have full confidence in the honesty of the members entrusted with setting policy and overseeing the Federal Reserve. In light of your deceitful and potentially criminal conduct in a financial matter, they cannot, and I do not have such confidence in your integrity, unquote. In a statement in response, Cook responded saying, President Trump purported to fire me for cause when no cause exists under the law, and he has no authority to do so. I will not resign. I will continue to carry out my duties to help the American economy as I have been doing since 2022, unquote. Alicia, part of the difficulty here is we don't have much more than these allegations circulated on social media. Lisa Cook has said that she is gathering the financial documents to respond to the substance of this charge. And yet we have the president already acting to fire her for just cause.
Right. So he made this allegation, Bill Pulte, the director of the Federal Finance Agency that oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which guarantee mortgages. Bill Pulte made this allegation that she may have, she didn't even say that she did. He said she may have misrepresented information in her mortgage applications, in two different mortgage applications in 2021, claiming, or that she stated that she had two homes, or she was applying for mortgages for two homes, both of which were quote unquote principal residences, that she planned to occupy over the next year. Now, Pulte says, well, it's not possible to occupy two different homes, and therefore she may have committed mortgage fraud by misrepresenting information on these applications. Now, there could be exculpatory evidence. She says that she's gathering, as you say, financial records, and seems to be planning to fight the Trump administration over her firing, and both perhaps the legal justification and the allegations that she actually did anything wrong. So I think that this is a live issue. It will definitely go to the courts. But I think the concerning thing is that the public, or President Trump, is essentially doing what his opponents did to him by publicly airing accusations that may or may not be true, in order to smear him.
Joe, to underline that point, we don't know exactly the results of this investigation and whether there will be any charges filed, whether there won't be any charges filed, what the analysis will show. There's a CNN report recently citing a former federal prosecutor that says a couple of things. One is that in order to have a criminal case against mortgage fraud, the false statement would have to be intentional at the time it was made. So again, according to this prosecutor, there are often cases where the borrower has a defense of saying, I didn't understand that. I didn't mean to check that box. Somebody else filled out that paperwork for me or whatnot. And then he also says that to prove mortgage fraud, again, according to the CNN report, they'd have to show that one of these banks would have made a different decision if Cook had listed one of the properties as a secondary residence. So we do not have Lisa Cook's story yet. I don't know why she hasn't put out her side of the story in public. She's presumably consulting with her defense lawyer about her best path forward on that. But there seem to be perhaps some hurdles to a criminal prosecution in this case, again, given the information that we have in the public right now. But there also raises the question of what just cause means in this law. The president is saying he's firing Cook for cause. This law does not define what that means. This was conduct that took place before Cook became a governor. And so that is part of what I think is going to go to the courts here if Cook files a suit is what does just cause mean in this context?
I mean, Kyle or Alicia, do either of you have any idea how long it is going to take to try the facts of this mortgage application issue if it goes that far, and then litigate this just cause issue about presidential appointment power and Fed officials? I don't have any idea, but I'm guessing a minimum of 2 years and possibly more. And so I think that really highlights a big part of the briar patch that we're all getting pushed into now, because we are in uncharted territory in terms of the sort of presidential attempt to remove a Federal Reserve official, and then also settling on an issue. I mean, I think that there are a couple of things to keep in mind about the specific allegation involved here, quite apart from the fact that so far we really only have Bill Pulte's word for any of that. You can make an argument that this kind of allegation is relevant to a Fed governor's ability to do his or her job, because, I mean, one of the things that the Federal Reserve does is financial system oversight. So you would hope in principle that they would all be honest in their own financial dealings. But, it's also true that these allegations seem to date to a period before Lisa Cook was on the Board of Governors. And so I think there's a real question about if there is any wrongdoing there after we get to the end of whatever long and tortuous legal process we're going to have. Why was none of this caught during the Senate confirmation process that she went through? And can you make an argument that perhaps there needs to be a sense of finality about that vetting process? I think one of the arguments on this issue of what constitutes just cause is going to be whether that can relate to allegations that predate someone's appointment, or whether it relates to their activities while they are in office. And no one is suggesting, as far as I'm aware, that Lisa Cook has been anything other than an honest and diligent member of the Federal Reserve Board, even if President Trump doesn't agree with her on policy issues like interest rates. So I think that this is an enormous mistake for Trump to be going down this path, because it's going to be very time consuming. It's going to be very confusing. It's going to be very constitutionally muddled the deeper into this we get. Markets are probably going to be freaked out by it to a certain extent. And if his goal is to get lower interest rates, either at the September Federal Open Market Committee meeting or at some point in the future, it's not clear to me that this is going to help that effort either.
Alicia, what's your view of this just cause question? There are other pieces of law dealing with other agencies that have just cause removal provisions and more tightly defined just cause. I think generally, in terms of malfeasance or negligence in office, I don't know if the courts would bring some of that background understanding of what Congress means by just cause in other places into an analysis of the Federal Reserve law. But there does seem to be some discretion in a phrase like just cause, because it requires the president to decide what is just.
Well, right. So there are many other agencies that include or statutes that govern the protections for other heads of independent agencies. The Federal Trade Commission Act provides for cause being quote unquote inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office, which clearly refers to conduct in office. Now, some others don't even provide for cause protections. They've just been applied to these agencies by virtue of the Humphreys executor precedent in 1935, which said that President Roosevelt couldn't fire members of the Federal Trade Commission except for cause, including inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office as defined by the law. So he couldn't just fire a member because he disliked or disagreed with their actions for policy reasons. Now, I think what the Trump administration may end up arguing in this case is that any such restrictions, for cause restrictions, or limitations on the president's authority to fire a federal board governor or Federal Reserve Board governor is per se unconstitutional, in part because it gets into the question of courts are having to second guess or question, well, does the president really have this authority, or his rationale? Is this pretextual? Or I think courts traditionally have been loath to decide these questions. So I think the broader, what seems more broadly, is that the administration may be trying to tee up a challenge to the removal protections for these Fed board governors more generally. And this also implicates that Humphrey's executor precedent that I mentioned that the Supreme Court hasn't fully overruled. Instead, it issued an opinion earlier this year. That was an unsigned opinion that allowed Mr. Trump to fire Gwen Wilcox, who was a member, another MS Merit Systems Review Board member, not based on for cause, and hinting that they were inclined to overrule Humphrey's executor, or at least that the federal agencies as structured today, because they actually exercise executive power, aren't really the kind of independent agency that the Supreme Court had in mind in 1935 when it restricted the president's removal authority on the basis that they were quasi-legislative judicial agencies. Instead, most federal agencies, and arguably the Federal Reserve, do exercise executive authority, at least in terms of the Federal Reserve, its regulatory power over banks. So I think that this is what Trump is trying to tee up more broadly in the courts. To Joe's point, this is going to be could become an extended fight that could take a couple of years. But if he gets a ruling in a lower court in his favor, he may go ahead to try to remove some other board of governors, and with the goal of stacking the Federal Reserve Board with his own appointees that will rule or will decide or vote on interest rates and other monetary policies in his favor.
Before we take on that larger question, one more point about the specifics related to Lisa Cook. Alicia used the term lawfare a moment ago about what this looks like. And the last time we discussed this, we had a listener, Pete, who wrote in objecting to that term. He said it is a federal crime to lie on loan requests. Prosecuting such offenders is not lawfare. It is enforcement of existing law. To snivel over who is being held to account is akin to a speeding motorist pointing to other speeding motorists as an excuse for what they knowingly engaged in. It is no defense and immaterial. And Joe, I guess my response to Pete is I think there are two separate questions here. One is whether Cook in fact made false statements on these mortgage documents, and if she did, that is bad. And two is whether President Trump's agencies are doing selective audits of the president's opponents, basically for political purposes. And if that's what is in fact going on under Bill Pulte, that would also be bad. I mean, to go back to the analogy of speeding, if the police set up a speed trap and they don't know who's going by, and I'm going by and I'm speeding and they happen to get me, I don't have much of a defense to say, well, the guy in front of me was also speeding. But this to me potentially looks more like if the police chief in town has a grudge against me for some personal reason and assigns a cop to tail my car 24/7 because at some point I'm going to do something wrong. I don't think that that would be okay. I don't think we want a world where every new president comes into office and orders the IRS to immediately audit members of the other party, donors to the other party, and whatnot. And that's true regardless of what those audits in the end find, if they find some wrongdoing by those individuals. Joe, I'll get off my soapbox and let you respond.
Yeah, I mean, the context always matters in these things. I mean, the central thing to understand about prosecutors is that they exercise discretion every day. I mean, there are so many laws in the federal code book that you could probably prosecute most government officials on most days for violating one of them somewhere. And, prosecutors make a prudential decision that that would be a bad use of prosecutors' time and taxpayers' money, paying the prosecutor's salary, and that it also would be bad for the democratic functioning of our government if we get in the habit of prosecuting officials as a pretext for what at root is a policy dispute. I mean, another part of the context here is the timing. I mean, this would be a very different discussion if something like this had come out during Lisa Cook's confirmation process. And that would have been a good opportunity if, in fact, it turns out that there was anything untoward about these mortgage applications. And we have to emphasize that we don't know yet because we only have the Trump administration's word for it at this point. If there were anything untoward there, that confirmation process would have been the perfect opportunity for lawmakers, democratically elected senators, to step in and say, hang on a sec, we think that this is disqualifying for someone who's been nominated to a seat on the Fed Board of Governors. That didn't happen then. We now find ourselves where the broader context is this policy dispute, and President Trump's attempt to exercise greater influence and potentially stack the Fed's Board of Governors with people who will do what he wants, particularly by slashing interest rates pretty deeply, for whatever political or economic goal he has. And in that context, Kyle, as you pointed out, I think essentially tasking the police officer with following you around on the hunt for any minor traffic infraction they can find, particularly if you happen to be a member of the city council, it's really dangerous. And we saw when the Biden administration did this against President Trump, that it can have big political consequences. And I think that Republicans are in danger of discovering the same on the other side here.
Alicia, to your point about the structure of the Federal Reserve, you mentioned this case involving Trump's effort to fire a member of the National Labor Relations Board. And there was a notable opinion from the Supreme Court in that case that sought to distinguish the Federal Reserve. Here's what it says. Respondents Gwen Wilcox and Kathy Harris contend that arguments in this case necessarily implicate the constitutionality of for-cause removal protections for members of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors. Goes on to say, we disagree. The Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks. And Alicia, what's your read of the background context that this is a dispute over Humphrey's executor, that precedent that is now percolating in the lower courts? It's reached the Supreme Court on an emergency basis and will probably get there eventually on a permanent basis. I mean, I guess I read Trump's letter and his effort to fire Lisa Cook for cause as at least an attempt to avoid pushing the Supreme Court on that point and trying to push back and say, no, actually, in the president's view, the Federal Reserve is the same as the National Labor Relations Board, and the president can fire any of those people at any time for any reason. I mean, is it wrong to read his effort to include a for-cause justification for Cook as an opportunity to let the Supreme Court avoid having to answer that question?
So I think there are two questions: whether Trump is actually even thinking about any of this, the legality, or if he's being. I think it's mostly directed by his advisors, and I think there are some of his advisors who really, really want to tee up this question of whether the Humphreys executor even applies to the Federal Reserve, and then there are others who want to avoid this question entirely. Now, by using the for-cause removal, he may just be hoping to get a quick victory in the courts, saying, well, I have a broad discretion over this agency and whether to remove board members. And therefore, I can remove her and potentially any others that are appointed. That would include presumably Michael Barr and Philip Jefferson, who were appointed by Joe Biden, and stack the board with governors who will cut rates, as Joe said, or otherwise, maybe undertake another round of quantitative easing. I don't think that's necessarily in the offing anytime soon, but essentially get a board that will do what he says on interest rates, and he can essentially take control of monetary policy that way. And notably, the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, that has 12 members that sets the interest rates. That includes both the board governors as well as some of the presidents of the regional banks. But those regional banks presidents can be fired by the board governor. So that could be one strategy. Another strategy, as I said, was maybe he really does want to tee up this case of whether whether the removal, whether it is constitutional to limit his ability to fire these Fed board governors because they exercise executive power. They don't just exercise quasi judicial or legislative power under that Humphreys executor precedent. Now, I think there's an argument to be made for that, in part because they do regulate the banks. They can fine them, penalize them. They also impose rules. I mean, that could be quasi legislative, but they do exercise enforcement power over the banks. And so maybe he's trying to tee that up again, this broader issue. You mentioned the essentially what it was dictat in another opinion earlier this year. The way I read that is the Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, was trying to dissuade and deter President Trump from firing the chairman, Jay Powell, because the court doesn't really want to address this broader question. There may be mixed feelings or mixed views on the court. A legal scholar, John Yoo, has argued that the first and second national banks of the U.S. are very different than the Fed as currently structured, not just because the Fed exercises regulatory authority over banks, but the fact that the first and second banks actually had private shareholders. They are very much privately institutions that were just government chartered. So there are key distinctions there. Now, I think this is all very interesting. This may eventually get up to the Supreme Court, as Joe said, but it could take a few years, and I'm not sure this is even going to be settled during the Trump presidency.
Joe, what are the implications of this dispute for the independence of the Federal Reserve, specifically with regard to the setting of monetary policy? President Trump is not the first person in the White House to want lower interest rates and to call up the head of the Federal Reserve and jawbone him on that point. But it seems like there is a pretty good historical read that having politicians in control of interest rates is potentially dangerous, because you get to a point where the guy who is running for re-election in a few months thinks it would be pretty good to juice the economy right about now.
Yeah, look, on this argument about Fed independence, I get it. I really do on both sides of it. So I think, Kyle, you have pointed out that, you always have to ask yourself, why did we create independent central banks in the first place? Why is this really the norm in developed economies these days? And it is precisely for the reason that you elaborated. I think there's been a concern that politicians, if given that power, would use it irresponsibly to try to juice their chances ahead of whatever is the closest election that we're coming up on, and that this would be detrimental for the long-term prospects of the economy. And in particular, the concern was always that politicians would have this desire or this inclination to push ahead with very easy or loose monetary policies right before an election to juke the economy somehow, and that would create inflation, which voters historically have found intolerable. I mean, inflation is the one thing that no voter anywhere is really prepared to put up with, as we have seen over the past couple of years. And so I think that was part of a trade-off. Now, I mean, there's a good argument on the other side of this, especially these days, that the central bank is too powerful of an institution to be completely devoid of democratic oversight. That they have enormous authority over the way that credit is allocated in the economy. I mean, this happens directly with policies like quantitative easing and the Federal Reserve's enormous balance sheet, which has become an issue since 2008. But it's also an issue in terms of banking regulation, which is another function that the Fed, along with many central banks around the world, take on. And there are enormous political and policy implications of that. So I think that you can make an argument on either side. Paradoxically, monetary policy is too important to be left to the politicians, and it's also too important to be left to the independent central bankers. But I think that the problem that we're running into with the Trump administration is that he doesn't actually care about that. I think that his interest is lower interest rates yesterday, and as low as they can go and as quickly as the Fed can get there, because he does want that, what he perceives is going to be a jolt of stimulus for the economy. And unfortunately, this means that we're going to miss out on a bigger opportunity for Federal Reserve reform. I mean, this has been bubbling along for a few years now as a sleeper issue on both the left and the right. I think that there is a emerging bipartisan consensus in Washington that the Fed isn't working quite right the way it's currently set up. I think Republicans and Democrats disagree about the precise nature of the dysfunction. But I think that you were starting to see some debate before the election about that. In fact, one of Trump's other current Fed Board of Governors nominee, Steve Moran, waded into this when he was at the Manhattan Institute last year. I think there's a real debate to be had in Congress about what form Federal Reserve independence should take. And I think a big concern has to be that these kinds of shenanigans that Trump is engaged in now end up moving that backwards, because I think that you can't really have a sensible conversation about what the Federal Reserve should be and how it should be managed when it is under this persistent, mule-headed political assault from the White House.
Thank you, Joe and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.